notebook from Catherine Croson, also known as Rivers Have Wings on Twitter. She had followed up on work from OpenAI, where they had implemented something called guided diffusion, where they trained a model on, I'm going to sort of butcher this, but they trained a model on by starting with a clean image and adding a little bit of noise in each step. And the model was supposed to predict like how much noise, what the difference of the noise was between the previous step and the current step. Like how much it was supposed to predict the noise that was added. And then when you train this model long enough on a wide variety of images, you end up with something that can start on the other side. You can start with noise and then predict the noise that would need to be added or subtracted to go towards a clean image. And they, at the time of releasing this, I believe they have something in this paper that says something like, we're releasing this model because we're not sure if it's possible, or we're not, it is difficult to use for image generation or something. And so of course, that gives a lot of motivation to people like Catherine and myself to be like, I don't know, it might work. And so I think it was pretty quickly after that she had gotten working with Cliff. Previously, like it was mostly for generating a specific class or unconditional generation of whatever data set they had trained it on. So like this Elsun bedroom data set, for example, here, that's just a big data set with a ton of bedroom images and hotel bedrooms. And so if you use that unconditionally without clip, you would just get a very nice, really realistic photo of a bedroom that you didn't guide with anything. It's just random, but it's going to look realistic like any of these. And
just so that everyone knows, like diffusion takes a long inference time, and that's why you have quick diffusion in your notebook. So
yeah,
just to back.
Yeah, and that's been changing over time, like with newer models. But the first models were quite slow because they were trained on 1,000 steps. So naturally, it was assumed that we should use it like for 1,000 steps as well. That would get you the best quality. But that takes really long. I can't remember the exact timing, but like I think it's something maybe like 10 minutes if you used a Google Colab GPU. Those 1,000 steps can take quite a while. So but the results from diffusion are what can be quite realistic, or it can really well like it can generate things that are very similar to the quality and content of the training material without overfitting. And so I wanted to try to get the best of both worlds whenever that's possible. So I wanted to keep as much quality while also drawing down the number of steps from 1,000. You could just go straight ahead and reduce the number of steps, but you're going to just get worse quality. So you need to sort of stick in some tricks, I guess. So I'm going to walk through this notebook. It's a little bit messy and there's some stuff in here that's not important anymore, but I'll just try to gloss over those. Yeah, I don't need to cover this stuff. Here you can see imports Torch and PyTorch library, very important for any of these models, any of these notebooks. A few of them use a different framework for machine learning called JAX, but for the most part, a lot of this stuff is in PyTorch. And the first thing that happens here is it'll print out what GPU Colab gave you, because you want to make sure you have one for one, and that it at least There's many different GPUs that Colab can provide you, or a handful, and based on the model name, you'll know if you're going to have a slow time or a faster time, a good time or a bad time. So this just sets up, it's downloading the diffusion model checkpoint files, which are pretty big, and cloning clip and Catherine's guided diffusion fork of OpenAI's guided diffusion repo. And this is just a ton of imports. Not really important to cover. This here is just some code to produce a sort of natural noise called Perlin noise. It's often used in like the, I think the graphics industry and the game industry for sort of natural, like if you wanted to, for example, procedurally generate a mountain range, you would use Perlin noise because it's sort of, I don't know, kind of natural looking. So this is code to produce some Perlin noise that is an option if you want to start with that instead of whatever the typical noise, the Gaussian noise, I think it is.
So this is like the starting point for ZVector.
Yeah, yeah. Or I don't know if it's called ZVector in diffusion, but basically yes, yeah. Where is it? So this, I mean, all of this stuff isn't too important. Anything here. This is one of the most important parts. So this class, make cutouts, because clip can only see 224 by 224 pixels at a time, it's really beneficial to cut up the images or cut up the image into multiple crops at different sizes to show clip the whole image. If you had if the image you're optimizing was only 224 or less, maybe you wouldn't need to do that. But if you're generating above 224, it's really helpful for you to take multiple crops. And I think this may have been pioneered by Ryan in the Big Sleep notebooks, which was optimizing Big GAN, because Big GAN was at 512 by 512. But if you optimize it with just resizing that to 224, you're going to end up just sort of blurrier results than you would have if you had gotten a closer shot. So this code here is doing a bunch of somewhat randomly sized cuts all across the canvas of the image. And up here, you can see these are torch vision augmentations. You'll see these or Cornea is another library versus torch vision that will apply transformations to your image. So like let's say here, there's random horizontal flip. That one's pretty clear. 50% of the time, it's gonna flip that crop of the image. So like these augmentations here get applied here on each individual crop or cutout. So for each individual crop, it's going to be randomly flipped. It's going to random affine here really means rotate. There's other things you can do with affine, but often when you see that, it means rotation. So this is a 15-degree rotation, or I think it'll go between like, you know, -15 to 15 or something like that. It'll wobble at random amounts between that value. Random perspective will sort of take, I'm going to show these later when I cover the next notebook. But yeah, just basically covering here, random perspective will just sort of take the image and put it at an angle, like in almost 3D space, in like pseudo 3D space. It'll perspective warp it, I guess. And color jitter will make it so each individual cutout looks a little bit different in color. And random grayscale will apply grayscale once in a while. So these are useful for different reasons. So in general, augmentations are something that I think really hit the scene, I don't know how many years ago, when it came to machine learning, training machine learning models. I think Stalgan Ada was really one that, like, I think brought it out to the zeitgeist or whatever, where adaptive discriminator augmentation, basically, they found that instead of training like Stalgan on, hundreds of thousands of images or whatever, you could take your data set of 1,000 images and augment it in similar ways that you're seeing here, where it's like rotations, stretching, colors, all sorts of stuff, contrast. And they were able to, match the same quality as if they had used a huge data set. And those same gains can be seen with these sorts of models, where if we trained without these augmentations for the same amount of steps, the results are going to just be straight up worse in different ways, but just generally straight up worse. Like, I'll see if I can show something later, but it's really important that Clip sees these images from different angles, different perturbation, that word's so weird, but different like augmentations to the image. So it doesn't get like sort of stuck. So what I mean by that is like Clip, if you don't cut an image or augment it, it can generate an adversarial image that like satisfies itself, but it doesn't look like that to us, right? Like if you told it to draw a cat and you didn't augment anything you were showing, then you might end up with noise that only Clip sees as a cat.
Daniel, I had a doubt. So if you're making cutout and then we are like flipping it at perspective, it might lose the continuity. Like if there is a face and half of my face is flipped, like it's losing the knowledge like which was gained in continuity.
That's a really good like question, or like, yeah, that I don't know if it's like, because this stuff is so new, I don't know if it's been like researched to the point that we could say that like anybody really has a good idea of how that all turns out. But in general, I think the fact that you take so many cutouts and that the process that these augmentations are randomized each time, not only for each cutout, but each iteration, they're also different. So Clip isn't just seeing it like at an angle all the time. It's this sort of average of almost like you can consider it noisy data. Yeah, noisy data, but it's not just data that has some noise on it, but like all kinds of noise, all kinds of different rotations and flips and everything. And it generally works out. Like I know what you're concerned about, like and I don't have a clear answer on that yet. Like, I don't know why that works out other than noisy. There's noisy data and it figures it out on average. Yeah. And so that's all that happens here. It comes in, the input here is the image. The image gets cut up this many times. Cut n is just the number of cuts or crops. And so I think we're probably using something like 16 in this notebook by default. So it's going to cut that image into 16 sub parts, some cutouts, and then augment them and then resize them to, this should really be called like Clip size. This is the size, this is like 224. This is what Clip expects to see. So yeah, so cut it out, augment it, resize it to the right size for clip, and then return it. And let me actually scroll down to where that happened, and I'll go back up a bit, but you can see where that cutouts class gets called here, where it's xn is sort of the, I believe it's the noised, it's the current predicted image plus, I think, noise on top of it. This iteration's noise, and it, you'll see here, there's an add 1 divide by 2 before it gets passed into the make cutouts function, because the outputs of the diffusion model are between -1 and 1, not between 0 and 1. And you'll see that with a few different models, not all of them, but a few different things. Like I think VQGAN is like that as well. But then confusingly, like one of the VQGAN models is not like that. Like one of them is 0 to 1 and one of them is -1 to 1. But yeah, adding 1 will normalize it to between 0 and 1, which is like what we expect for images to be displayed. And then after that, it's cut out. This normalize function is a specific one. It's oh, where is it? Here we go. That normalize that I was calling is a specific sort of standard deviation and mean for the data set that Clip was trained on. So whenever you show an image to Clip, you need to run it through this normalization. Otherwise, like, you'll see some oddities with color. Just, yeah, things will be maybe a little bit like pinker and greener, if I remember right. Yeah, kind of odd. So it gets, where are we? So it gets cut out. It gets cut out, normalized, and now it's in this clip in variable. Clip in gets sent to the clip models encode image function. And out comes the image embeds. And what's, some of this you can like mostly ignore. This is just sort of reshaping of the tensor to match some other shapes that held the like prompts and the weights of those prompts, because you can weigh things in different amounts so that some prompts have more value or more precedence than others. But this line right here is where there's a distance lost between the image embeds that you just encoded from Clip and the target embeds, which are defined, those just contain the prompts that you're trying to match. And then the next line is really, this isn't something that you'll find like in all these notebooks. This is for a specific scenario that allows us to run multiple rounds of cuts while saving memory. Like we can do, like, let's say 4 times the amount of cuts by splitting it up 4 times. So if you wanted to do 32 cuts, but you didn't have the memory for it on your hardware, you could do 8 cuts 4 times. And what this line is doing is accumulating the gradient each time. So this is like adding the loss to this variable that later is used to store the like final gradient value. That gradient value is what informs the diffusion model, whether it's on the right path. This notebook, unlike a lot of other clip guided notebooks, you won't find an optimizer, a PyTorch optimizer like Atom or anything. It uses AutoGrad, sort of built-in, a sort of built-in PyTorch, I guess, optimizer. I don't know, but that you won't really see this in other notebooks. Just pointing that out is kind of not unique, but unusual. So after the cuts are made, and we have the encoding, we have the loss between the distance between the image embeds and our target prompt. Here come the other losses. So I mentioned like, you don't have to rely on just clip loss. If you have some specific style in mind or something that you need to optimize for, you can apply additional losses. So this first one here is TV loss, which is total variation loss. And it's a, this can sort of prevent the overly noisy or like, I call it like crusty look to an image when it's just like really grainy. Yeah, really grainy or noisy. Total variation loss can sort of smooth things out. And you can like, one, like, I don't know if this will really help anybody imagine, but like if you had really high TV loss on something that you're optimizing, you would end up like really, really high. You would end up with something that's like super smooth. There might be something in the middle. Like let's say it was a portrait of a person and there'd be somebody in the middle. And the background might be like super smooth and like an average of brown, sort of like this light brown, because it's this, it's minimizing the amount of variation, if I recall correctly. Like the pixels next to each other shouldn't be that different from each other, I think is how what it calculates.
So
yeah.
right now we don't have any text embedding or not even connection to generators. So are this like, this loss are on image itself so that it's like smooth, right? Like it's not like comparing with the output yet.
Yeah, or like it's not, it doesn't care about what clip thinks, at least. It's just only on the image itself. Yeah. And there's some, there's a loss here that tries to keep the values within a same range here. So within the -1 to 1, essentially. And, sorry, my dog is bothering me. And this is so that you don't get like sort of insane images that are like either like really white or really black, like it's gone too far in a certain direction and it becomes like really saturated, basically. Range loss will sort of, without like manually clamping the value, because you could clamp the value every iteration, like to make sure that it stays between -1 and 1, but that's not great for gradients. That's not great for trying to optimize a gradient. You might end up with what, like a no gradient, and then your image breaks. So it's better to like use something like a loss to convince, like to sort of edge it towards something rather than like just force it on it. And so this tries to keep it within range. And then the loss just adds up all those losses, like the TV loss, the range loss, the stat losses, and then those all get added together sort of to the clip loss from earlier. It all gets added into one value called grad here, and then that gets returned. I'll try to cover, so this stuff doesn't actually do anything. There's some lines in here that don't do anything, just erase that one. This section here is sort of like, it's sort of a similar like reason why you want the range losses, in that like it clamps the, like it limits how far each iteration modifies the image in a way. It limits it, it restricts it, not just modifies it. Like it makes it so that there is an upper limit on how much can change, like how large the gradient value can be that gets sent back to the diffusion model for the next step.
Kind of rate of learning.
Yeah, essentially, it's sort of like learning rate. Yeah, we don't have an optimizer here, so this is sort of like equivalent. And you like, what this allows you to do is use a higher clip guidance scale, like be more forceful about how much you want the image to look like your prompt without having it go crazy and explode into like a terrible oversaturated image. Because it'll make a jump, a step that's too big. It'll maybe suddenly become like thick white and black and red lines, for example, that might represent the shape of the thing you're going for. But then in the next steps, it never really gets better. It sort of went too far. And part of that is like, I mean, that's a general problem, but part of that is related to how it seems like diffusion does not do well with solid colors. And what I mean by not do well is like, if there's a solid area of color and not much detail, it's not going to change really through the next iterations. And that the same is true if you use an init image. If you started with an image and it had solid blocky areas, it's probably not going to change much. So if you use like a black and white silhouette, well, you know what a black and white silhouette looks like?
Yeah.
Use a black and white silhouette, it's going to generally stay like that for the most part, because there's nothing to diffuse, I guess. There's nothing to denoise at that point. So that this helps with that for sure. And the higher you have this, sorry, the lower you have this clamp max value, which I have in like the settings cell down lower, the lower you have this, the like, I guess, more restricted it is, the lower this value is. And I don't know if this is really accurate, but I've explained it before to somebody as like, the difference between like, let's say a clip score of 1,000 and not having this versus a clip score of like 10,000 and having this is like, without this and your clip score without, or your clip guidance scale of 1,000, you like open the window and you're yelling out of the window for like a minute or whatever, versus with a very high clip score and this clamping, clip gets a chance to like raise that window and yell as loud as it can and then shut it before it's like, I don't know, before it disturbs the whole neighborhood. It gets a chance to like make a big change without ruining it. Like it's like a burst, like a burst of energy, you know, without a sustained explosion or something. So that's sort of how you can think of it. So if you ever want to experiment with like with that, like if you want to raise the clip guidance, you probably want to lower the clamp max. Exactly. What else we got here? There's like technically two different kinds of diffusion. Well, there's several kinds now, but here in this notebook, you'll see something referencing DDIM, which is it's an alternative way of diffusing or denoising images. I don't remember what it stands for. Denoising diffusion implicit models. They were demonstrated in this paper to be like way faster than the original kind of diffusion models, which are DDTM, denoising diffusion probabilistic models, I think. And well, I don't know. I haven't really found this to be the case in clip guided stuff. Like this is something that's repeated a lot, but I don't really see that it's true. Supposedly DDIM is better for shorter steps. I thought that as well as at the beginning, but I empirically so far, I don't know if that's true. But anyway, there's two different kinds of schedules. If you do use DDIM, you'll find that the image will, it has a higher reliance on the initial image, or the, not just like your own input, but you know, the initial noise too. It won't make huge drastic changes. If you watch it in progress, it really looks like something denoising. versus the default DDPM, you'll see it like I don't know, as if somebody's splashing some ugly noisy paint every iteration, right? But with DDIM, you'll just see it sort of slowly denoise. If you have your clip guidance really high, you can, make it move a little bit more. But either way, in general, I'd say if you're using one of these scripts, you should stay away from DDIM, unless you have something specific in mind, like you do have an initial image that you want to stay somewhat similar to, that you want to sort of make a variation of an existing image. You might want to use DDIM because then it won't venture too far. And I'll show you where you use DDIM or not in a second.
So what is desirable, that smooth transition or like a splashy way of modification? Because like if I want like a drastic change, I might go for like splashy way. If I want like gradual change, I might go with the other model.
Yeah, for the most part, you're gonna want to go with the default DDPM. Because I say like it's noisy and splashy, I just mean that like you can see that something's happening. Versus if you look at DDIM, you just see it slowly resolve, but it won't change that much. Like you won't, yeah, it's difficult to get it to better represent what you want. I have it here. Oh, so this part of the code, it just loops over a number of batches. If you wanted to, generate several batches of images, you can set that down in the settings. And let's see what I have here. This line here, fuzzy prompt, is a param I have in the settings cell that allows you to add a little bit of noise to your prompt. So like I was explaining earlier, you might have something that's too specific, and clip, can approximate it, but it's not in a good space in clip's embedding space, and you might not get something good out of it. But what this fuzzy prompt is supposed to do is it takes your target embeddings and it just adds some normal distributed Gaussian noise on top of it. So you have like almost like a wider, it's almost like you expanded that field of what that text prompt could be. And it changes with each batch. I have it set here too. So you can make sure, like what this can also do is make it so that each batch of images, or even if you're not, even outside of the context of batches, it can make it so that each image, if you did the same prompt over and over and over, there would be more variety. Like there's already variety. If you're not familiar with clip guided generation, text prompts don't always produce the same image, except in very like specific models if you do a lot to like make it deterministic. But even then, changing the seed will give you a different image. But doing this can make it even more variety, like can add even more variety to each image. And this just sets up the sampling function that you call. This is the diffusion model sampling function. None of this is really important to cover. And then here is where the progress is displayed and saved to file. So you can see here, it enumerates over the samples returned from the sample function. And with each one, it's going to, if the current iteration of the loop is matching this display rate setting that you set down below, then it's going to loop over the images in that batch and save them to a file and display them inside the notebook. And if you do happen to use this notebook, there's some convenience features for connecting your Google Drive to save those as well. So you head down here. So when I was saying that you can set DDIM somewhere, this is where you would do it. I have it defaulted to, this is by default DDPM. you don't type that here, but for DDIM, you do type DDIM to that gets split out from the number, and it informs the diffusion sampling function that you want to use DDIM style denoising. Diffusion steps, oddly enough, like if you want to do only 50 steps, you don't change diffusion steps to 50. You change time step respacing to 50. And it's called time step respacing because as far as I understand, it's like taking whatever those 1,000 steps would have been and just respacing it into a smaller area. The same, like, I guess like whatever the schedule would have been of the amount of noise that gets added is just sort of shortened. But if you wanted to go above 1,000 steps for whatever reason, maybe not the best idea in my notebook, then you would also need to increase diffusion steps and make time step respacing 2,000 if you want to go above 1,000. For some reason, if you're going below 1,000, you don't need to change it. You can just leave it where it is. And none of this.
So like the time respacing made this whole procedure quick.
Yeah, like so if you don't have the extra, so I've added some stuff, like a lot of what you saw in the make cutouts was stuff that I had added. And there's some other bits throughout this notebook, but without those, if you drop this to just 50 steps, it would be like pretty bad quality, or like, yeah, you wouldn't get much of a good image.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's just a feature of the model itself. That's not like this notebook. This value goes right in here into the model config.
Got it.
None of the other stuff is really worth paying attention to. You can change the resolution of these models, but it's a bit like hacky because the models were trained to be a certain size. And what makes diffusion models pretty interesting is they have a really good idea of composition, of scene composition, not like prompt composition. That's another thing. Like sometimes people use the word composition in the clip world to mean like how well clip composed two concepts into one image. Versus here, I mean like the general scene composition. Diffusion is really good at getting it right, matching the sort of what was in the data set. So when you go and change that, you're relying a lot more on clip to guide the whole process, to sort of make up for the lacking ability of the diffusion model. Without that, without like some fine tuning of the clip scale and whatnot, you would find that, let's say you used the 512 model, but you made it wide, like 640. You might have found that like the first 512 looked like a regular scene, and then the next like 128 was like a side scene. It's not like a line between it or anything, but it's like obviously this is like the temple or whatever, right? The whole temple, and over here was a tree. You know, that might happen, for example. So it's hacky. A lot of people do it. But just keep in mind that like diffusion models are best used as they were trained. So you can train a diffusion model to be wide. And I think people are like in the middle of working on that now. It all just comes down to data set. And yeah. So you can change these values. It'll work. It'll use more of the GPU VRAM of the memory. So it might depend on what you got, what kind of hardware you're working with. And the rest of this it's not important. Here's where clip gets loaded. We used specifically VITB16 clip, which is slightly the sort of default that released in January. The most commonly used one was VITB32. You can use that as well, especially if you're like time or resource constrained. But VITB16 has a smaller, it's called patch size. It saw with basically finer detail when it was training. and it also like perceives with smaller patch, finer detail when you're using it like this. So in general, on average, images generated with VIT-v16 will be a little bit more detailed. And it also sort of learned more information in a way than 32 did. And so that just loads up clip. And here's where, like most people, this is where most people would sit to interact with the script. Where you see you can set your text prompts here. You can have multiple. That's why I have this as an array. And it'll try to go towards like both of them. Earlier I mentioned weights. You can set weights in this notebook. Like I wanted it to be mostly a gateway to Eternal Dread, but like a quarter towards Cyberpunk Wizard, you would do it like this with these weights, where you might say, oh, I don't want any dogs. So you'd have negative 0.25 dog. If you generated something and you saw something that you didn't like show up, then you might want to use a negative weight to avoid that thing showing up.
I had one question about the weight. So basically, if there's no weight, everything is given equal weight, and you average out the text prompt and in the embedding. And how does like a dog of 0.25 weight versus dog of 1 weight, like in the visual, like what's the difference?
It's sort of, if I remember right, it's like you're adding, when you average these together, it's like each of these things is like a direction or something in vector space. I'm probably going to butcher this again, but it's like the hyperdimensional 512 dimension embedding space of clip embeddings. A prompt sort of points in a direction in that embedding space. And so the weight that you apply to it, the weight that you apply to it, if you had more than one thing, would sort of move it a quarter as much in that direction. Like there's less influence towards that so-called direction in embedding space. So I don't know if you're asking this, but I don't know what exactly is the difference between having like just one, like just a single, like this versus this. I think it might just take longer. Like I think it might just not be as strong of a clip score, basically. If you do this alone versus this. But in the context of like combining things, it's sort of intuitive how you would imagine, like it's just sort of a little bit of this, a lot of this. Like it works out in general like that. But things get kind of weird when you're combining like really different concepts. Like surprisingly, I don't know. You have to try out whatever ideas you have and see how it goes. Because it's difficult to tell how it'll go.
Because I was thinking like if based on the weight, is the size of the dog being affected or the number of the dogs being affected, or like if it's because each of these weights are fighting to get some representation in the image. Like the higher weight will get, I guess, like more image space.
Yeah. So in general, like there's just what do you call it? Like there's an effect on the image that's sort of hard to quantify, but when you're saying about the dog getting larger, that is a possibility, because if you showed clip images of dogs, or let's say to make things really maybe scientific, the same dog from different zoom levels, the one that's like, closest to the full dog, but like full frame, it's only dog, that one's going to have the highest clip score. So technically, maybe you get more of a bigger dog, like literally a bigger portion of the image could be dog. And I saw this So that's something I should bring up. Actually, some way that people judge the quality of clip generated images is based on the clip score, which makes sense, but that's not always like accurate. Like that's not always gonna match your own personal, your own personal quality judgment. It's pretty okay, like it's pretty on point, I guess. But there's problems like that. Like bigger things are bigger things are more important than how high quality it is or something. So like I wish I had this image around, but early on I had made it so that when I did a batch of images, it would show them all in one grid with each iteration. And the order of the grid would be reordered based on the clip score.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw, like, in whatever this prompt was, there was a prompt of a portrait of somebody. Some of the best ones were at the bottom, but they were like full body from a little bit farther away. Whereas the ones at the top were all obviously like the face, like taking up the whole frame. And those weren't necessarily the best ones. It's not that they were like bad, but there's always some at the bottom that would be like, that one would be pretty good. Like I would consider that top 10. So it's something that you need to keep an eye out for yourself. And it's something, so like DALL-E had relied on this. OpenAI's other project, DALL-E, was a straight up generator that they never released. If, what is it? Saying, oh yeah, it would generate like 512 images for the prompt, and then have clip pick like the best 8, for example. And I mean, it probably worked out pretty well. I mean, as we saw in the results on their blog, like the results they showed are really good. But just like from a personal, like artistic standpoint, you might find that it's not always accurate.
And lastly, I was thinking, for example, we are using this prompt, the words and the way to have some control on the image. And let's say I want to have like a dog on the left side of the image. Like I can have it on the prompt too, like, okay, dog on cyberpunk, wizard on left side. Like how, at what level we are able to control the generation?
So with today's clip, it's a little bit unpredictable. I think OpenAI was very upfront about the fact that clip is not great at counting. It's not great at position, like dog on the left, dog on the right. It will work sometimes if you specify it. It will work sometimes, but don't always expect it to work out. And now there are like new models or papers that I've seen that are different kinds of transformers, like different kinds of vision transformers that take into account the position a lot more. And so you can say something like a green ball on top of a red cube, whereas if you try that with clip guiding something, you don't really know whether one's going to be on the top or not, or like if there's going to be 3 of them instead of 2 of them or whatever. Sometimes it works. Oh, here's an interesting pro tip. I haven't used this because I just remember this from the early days. I found early on that maybe because of the way that the clip, just because of some bias in the data set, I found that it was more consistent to name 3 people, like not necessarily known names, just like Tom, Dick, and Harry. And that would make 3 people or 3 whatever, like let's say it was a photo of Tom, Dick, and Harry, my favorite badgers. And it would be 3 badgers pretty consistently. But if I asked for 3 badgers, it was less consistent. So I don't I haven't tried that in a long time, but that kind of surprised me. And then here I have image prompts. These can be URLs. and I just have mono JPEG, just a random example. If you drop in a file over into this section, then you can reference it like this, mono JPEG. Otherwise, you would just put a HTTPS URL here. And image prompts work just the same, or I don't know, well, just the same, but it's the same idea as text prompts because the images are in the same embedding space and whatnot. But image prompts are a little bit more specific. Like text prompts cover a whole concept, whereas image prompts are a little bit more constrained. Like you might end up more similar to your image prompt, whereas like, you know, this is pretty open-ended. Cyberpunk Wizard is pretty open-ended. So for the most part, these values should be okay. Like, if you want to play with these, like I mentioned earlier, clip guidance scale, if you raise this anymore, you'd probably want to lower this clamp max value. This will clamp the gradient magnitude. There's some, so like here's TV scale that controls the smoothness. If this wasn't here, the results might be a little bit more grainy. And some of this stuff I wouldn't really touch, like unless you really know what you're doing, there's no reason to touch these. Cut in, so this is the number of crops taken of the image. In general, the higher this is, the better quality. But there's diminishing returns. There's no need to go like all out. And of course, this number really depends on your hardware. So like I have this set so that it could work on any Colab GPU. But if you found, like, if you knew that you had some more memory to spare, you could increase this. If you wanted to try to get more cuts in, but you didn't have the memory to spare, then you could increase cut in batches, which will do the thing I mentioned earlier about looping over. I should mention that like this means that it'll do 16 twice. This does not mean that it will cut 16 into 2. So like if 16 is giving you out of memory, don't just increase this. Make sure to lower this. But if you wanted 16, then you'd go 8 too, or whatever. This will actually technically be 32. So just pointing that out. An image you could set here. And so this is like if you want to modify an image you already have, or a template, or anything like that, you would use it here as your init image. And this value here is how many time steps you want to, well, it's pretty clear from the name, but it's how many time steps you want to skip at the beginning of the process. The first few steps of diffusion, generally, well, especially if you have it shortened down to 50 steps, the first few steps make big jumps, really big jumps. So it has the same problem that I mentioned earlier about getting oversaturated or getting super, like getting stuck in some ugly blocky mess. Skipping the first 8 time steps worked out well for me with this specific diffusion model. I don't have like this is just an empirical number that I came to, but it generally works out. If you lowered clip guidance scale or increase the number of time step respacing steps, then you could probably maybe lower this a little bit. But yeah, that's why that's there. Oh, right. So, but the reason I'm bringing it up is if you use an init image, you're going to want to increase this more. This is the value that's used all the time, even if you don't have an init image. If you do have an init image and you want it to be actually visible by the end, you want to change skip time steps to like match, to be like at least half of the number of time step respacing value. So like it's 50 steps, so you probably want to do 25 steps. If you did like 40 steps, it would be very similar to the init image. Not much would change. Like, and the earlier you go, the more you lose, basically.
Got it.
So if you went really early, that might be useful for if, like, some people use templates. Like, for example, if you wanted to generate a bunch of Nike shoes, something like you've probably seen some of those projects out there, then you would have this like basic shoe template, and you would have it like maybe 15 out of the 50 steps or something. so that you don't retain much of the detail of the original. You don't want those details, you just want the shape. Then you would go, yeah, like something like that, 15 out of 50. And generally don't change anything else. And I mostly covered all it. Like the fuzziness, if you want the fuzzy prompts, you can turn this on, and then this depicts how wide that randomness should apply to your text prompt. And then you hit this to actually run the process, and you'll just start seeing images spit out at the bottom here. I can get this running, but like, I don't know if I want to wait for the diffusion to run. I have something else locally that I was going to show that runs really quickly, and we'll get to see the augmentations that I was talking about.
This is like a crash course on Clip. Like, I can't thank you enough. Like, really gives a clear picture of things, and the hyperparameters which are affecting it. So
yeah, there's a lot to keep track of. This I was going to mention, if you're of a more scientific mind, like, or you have a very specific creative vision in mind, you should make use of seeds. By default, I have the seed pick a random number each time. If you're not familiar, a seed is what's sort of used in a random number generator, which are really like a lot of these differentiable processes, like in PyTorch and whatnot, use random number generators as part of the process. And setting a specific one will allow you to, like, if you're trying to test whether some settings are making a change, you're going to want to stick to one seed. Otherwise, you don't really know. Like, you know, like, ooh,